Brian Wilson Aldiss was born on August 18, 1925 and died on August 18, 2017. He was an English writer and anthologies editor, best known for science fiction novels and short stories. His byline reads either Brian W. Aldiss or simply Brian Aldiss, except for occasional pseudonyms during the mid-1960s. Greatly influenced by science fiction pioneer H. G. Wells, Aldiss was a vice president of the International H. G. Wells Society. He was, with Harry Harrison, co-president of the Birmingham Science Fiction Group. Aldiss was named a Grand Master by the Science Fiction Writers of America in 2000, and inducted by the Science Fiction Hall of Fame in 2004. He received 2 Hugo Awards, 1 Nebula Award, and 1 John W. Campbell Memorial Award. He wrote the short story, Super Toys Last All Summer Long, 1969, the basis for the Stanley Kubrick-developed Steven Spielberg film AI. Artificial intelligence. Aldiss was associated with the British new wave of science fiction. Aldiss's father ran a department store that his grandfather had established, and the family lived above it. He started to write stories as a 3-year-old which his mother would bind and put on a shelf. At the age of 6, Brian was sent to board at West Buckland School in Devon, and then on to Framlingham College. After the war, he worked as a bookseller in Oxford. He wrote a number of short pieces for a bookseller's trade journal about life in a fictitious bookshop, which attracted the attention of Charles Monteith, an editor at the publisher Faber and Faber. As a result, Aldiss's first book was The Bright Fount Diaries, Faber, 1955. A 200-page novel in diary form about the life of a sales assistant in a bookshop. About this time he also began to write science fiction for various magazines. According to ISFDB, his first speculative fiction in print was the short story Criminal Record, published by John Carnell in the July 1954 number of Science Fantasy. Several of his stories appeared in 1955, including 3 in monthly issues of New Worlds, a more important magazine also edited by Carnell. In 1954, The Observer newspaper ran a competition for a short story set in the year 2500. Aldiss's story Not for an Age was ranked 3rd following a reader vote. The Bright Fount Diaries had been a minor success, and Faber asked Aldiss if he had any more writing that they could look at with a view to publishing. By this time, his earnings from writing matched his wages in the bookshop, and he made the decision to become a full-time writer. Aldiss led the voting for Most Promising New Author of 1958 at the next year's World Science Fiction Convention, but finished behind no award. He was elected president of the British Science Fiction Association in 1960. He was the literary editor of the Oxford Mail newspaper from 1958 to 1969. Around 1964 he and longtime collaborator Harry Harrison started the first-ever journal of science fiction criticism, Science Fiction Horizons, which during its brief span of 2 issues published articles and reviews by such authors as James Blish, and featured a discussion among Aldiss, C.S. Lewis, and Kingsley Amis in the first issue, and an interview with William S. Burroughs in the second. Besides his own writings, he had great success as an anthologist. For Faber he edited Introducing SF, a collection of stories typifying various themes of science fiction, and Best Fantasy Stories. In 1961 he edited an anthology of reprinted short science fiction for the British paperback publisher Penguin Books under the title Penguin Science Fiction. This was remarkably successful, going into numerous reprints, and was followed up by 2 further anthologies, More Penguin Science Fiction, 1963, and Yet More Penguin Science Fiction, 1964. The later anthologies enjoyed the same success as the first, and all 3 were eventually published together as the Penguin Science Fiction Omnibus, 1973, which also went into a number of reprints. In the 1970s, he produced several large collections of classic grand-scale science fiction under the titles Space Opera 1974, Space Odysseys 1975, Galactic Empires 1976, Evil Earths 1976, and Perilous Planets 1978, which were quite successful. Around this time, he edited a large-format vol Science Fiction Art 1975 with selections of artwork from the magazines and pulps. In response to the results from the planetary probes of the 1960s and 1970s, in 1948, Aldiss married Olive Fortescue, secretary to the owner of Sanda's Booksellers in Oxford, where he had worked since 1947. He had 2 children from his first marriage, Clive in 1955 and Caroline Wendy in 1957, but the marriage finally collapsed in 1959 and was dissolved in 1965. In 1965, he married his second wife, Margaret Manson, a Scottish woman, secretary to the editor of the Oxford Mail. He was 40, and she 31. They lived in Oxford and had 2 children together, Tim and Charlotte. He died at 95.